All right. Hello, my friends, and welcome to the very first podcast episode slash live stream for the Indigo Women. I am your host, Natalie, and I'm so excited that you're here today. So, I want to tell you, first of all, a little bit about the Indigo Women. We are a group that you can find on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, basically all over social media. Our website is theindigowomen.com. And our mission is to provide elevated, soul powered women with the support and sisterhood that they need so they may release limiting beliefs, claim their wholeness, and lead from their highest and most authentic self. So, we are very high vibe women who are dedicated to a spiritual path of just becoming the most aligned versions of ourselves and also really embracing the human experience. So, embracing the fact that we have this really cool higher self consciousness that leads us intuitively every day, and also embracing the fact that we have a very human ego side that is there to be our teacher. So, within this community, we are constantly encouraging one another to enjoy the human experience to its fullest, to learn and integrate the lessons from whatever we experience, positive or negative. And on this podcast, I will be sharing little lessons, tips, bits of information to help guide you on your path. So, a little disclaimer, the sound quality today is not going to be super perfect yet. My podcast equipment is still in the mail, so the sound quality will be improving over time. But I was very eager and excited to get this live stream slash podcast rolling. So I hope that you don't mind the amateur sound quality today. It is going to improve next week. So, with that said, today our focus is going to be on the transformative power of language and how changing our words can reshape our reality. We can actually change the way that we see life based on the words that we use. Now, there's a good chance that you're already familiar with that idea, but we're going to go really deep into it today. We're going to talk about the psychology of positive talking, positive speaking. We're going to talk about the impact of negative, especially negative self-talk. So we're all pretty familiar that if we complain a lot, it's going to make us feel icky. But then there's also the way that we talk to ourselves. That's also going to create emotional states. So if we're talking to ourselves negatively, that can affect our emotional state negatively. We're going to talk about how the way we speak and the way that we think can actually give us the opportunity to rewire some of the limiting beliefs in our subconscious mind. We're going to talk about gratitude. And finally, we will talk about practices for daily use. So this is about to be a jam-packed episode. If you are a note taker, I do recommend maybe grabbing a pen and paper and settling in, especially if this is something that you really want to start applying to your daily life as soon as possible. I highly recommend that. And please, as always, feel free to share your commentary. I love interacting with my clients, followers, listeners. So always share your thoughts and then we can all learn from one another. Indigo Women is meant to be a community experience where we can have that type of intimacy together. And that includes sharing. So please feel free to do so as we go. So before we dive into the transformative power of language, I wanted to start by telling you a little bit of my own story so you can see how I became inspired to create a group like Indigo Women. So Indigo Women is very much a spiritual group, but it is not a religious group. I grew up very, very religious. I grew up extremely Catholic in the Midwest. You know, we went to church every single week. We definitely went every single holiday. We prayed morning, noon, and night. I went to Catholic school, the whole nine yards. And basically everything about my childhood in one way or another went back to my Catholic roots. So both on my mom's side and my dad's side, very religious grandparents. I was born into it, right? And there was, of course, also purity culture connected to that. So very, very much surrounding especially my sexuality as a woman. It was all about being very pure and waiting until marriage, so on and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead right now and let you know that when I tell my story, because there's little bits of explicit detail in there, because it does help round out the reasoning for why I have chosen to create Indigo Women. Little trigger warning for SA and ED. Okay. So even as a child, I had this really desperate desire to connect with God. Like, I have this very clear memory of being in first grade. I was 5 years old. I started school really early. So I started kindergarten when I was 4. I was 5 or 6 years old in first grade. And my teacher, she was a brand new teacher. It was her first year teaching. So she was maybe like 22, something like that. And she had created all these little stations around the classroom. There's a math station, a reading station, writing station, art station, whatever. And there was a prayer station. And I was like the only kid that was excited to sit at the prayer station. And I just distinctly remember her getting so excited that, like, oh my God, one of the kids wanted to pray. And I was like, yeah, of course I do. I love God. And it was something I always felt really deeply connected to. I always talked to my guardian angels when I was a kid. I was always, it might have been a little much, but I was always really fascinated by spirituality, and I enjoyed the church songs. And I don't know, I was cool with going to church every day, not every day, but I was an altar server. How about that? Any altar servers in the house? So anyway, very, very churchy upbringing. So it's important for me to talk about that, because one of the things that became apparent really quickly is that I did always feel this hunger for God, but at the same time, God always felt kind of elusive, right? So he, first of all, was a he, and he was a guy. And I had seen, the Greek and Roman paintings of God, and he's always this bearded man, very Zeus-like. So of course, in my head, that was who I was praying to, and that's who I was talking to, and Jesus. And it was always like these male figures that were outside of me. That was how I had always envisioned God. And like, God was so awesome when you were good, and he loved you when you were good. But if you were bad or made a mistake, or, having a bad day and just crabby, well, then like God just doesn't love you as much, which is so messed up. But that was how I viewed it. And I had this like constant craving for deep spiritual connection. But the God of the religion that I grew up with was very distant. And I distinctly remember having a moment when I was 17. Believe it or not, I got even more religious as a teenager. I know, ridiculous. So I went to Catholic church in the mornings on Sundays, and then I went to non-denominational church in the evenings on Sundays. So I did double church duty throughout my teenage years. I know, pretty cool, right? I was super cool. Actually, it was pretty cool. I don't know. I had friends who did the same thing, so like we vibe. So there was a moment where I was in the non-denominational church thing. It was like a night mass, basically, where it was, rock and roll music to God in an auditorium. If you've never experienced that before, it's really wild. They basically put on a rock concert for God every week, and it's very emotional because live music can be very emotional. So the lights are dimmed, and sometimes they'll have like a light show or something like that, and soulful singers and people, on their guitar. And it's like this whole like you pour your heart out through the music. So you're already, it doesn't matter what people are singing, like music is emotional anyway, but it was supercharged because it was like spiritual, right? And then the pastor would come out and deliver this sermon that was from his heart and from his soul, and he was, letting God speak through him, and that's how it was presented. And I just distinctly remember being 17 years old and the preacher saying, like, you will never be good enough for God. It doesn't matter what you do. You will never be good enough for God. And I ran to the bathroom and had this massive breakdown. I mean, we want to talk about the power of language. Like, that was something that affected me so deeply of like, I was devastated to hear that. And because someone who had power in the church was saying it, I embodied that. And I had this breakdown of, oh my God, like it doesn't matter what I do. I'm never going to be loved by like the one entity whose love I crave the most. So that was the beginning of me starting to question things because I went, wait a minute. All right. So if God is all loving and perfect and, it can forgive anyone for anything, why on earth would he create these humans who are so imperfect and then constantly remind them of their imperfection and that they're never going to be good enough? And it started to raise a little red flag in my brain of like, wait a minute, there is some dissonance going on here. There's some cognitive dissonance between what y'all are saying and what God seems to be doing. And this is all weird. But I had intertwined my identity with religion so deeply at that point, and I was still a kid, right? So I wasn't ready to face that. I wasn't ready to look at it yet until 2 years later when I was sexually assaulted by somebody who I really trusted and who was also part of the church and who was also in my Bible studies. So, as you can imagine, that was, if you're into tarot, a massive tower moment for me where everything collapsed. Everything collapsed because there were already these little red flags that have been popping up in my brain for a couple of years, which I had very, like a whack-a-mole, been working on shoving them down as much as I could and ignoring them. And all of a sudden, this event happens, this one thing, all it took was one thing. And remember, there was also this purity culture that I had grown up in, which was the minute you are no longer pure, you are not godly and God doesn't want anything to do with you. Suddenly, I absolutely tailspinned, completely tailspinned. And I'd already had a little bit of an eating disorder before that, but I had a full blown eating disorder after that. And this was when I lost my identity, my religious identity completely, and I began to distrust all things spiritual. All things spiritual. I was like, look, if it is not backed by science, I don't want to hear about it. It's all woo woo, it's all BS, it's none of it's real. And of course, obviously, things have changed. That all happened when I was like 19, 20, and we're a good 12 or 13 years later. So obviously, things have changed. But in that moment, I needed to really wipe the slate clean. And it was painful. It was painful. If anyone has ever gone through a dark night of the soul and has had your absolute identity ripped out from underneath you, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So this dark night of the soul lasted for a couple of years, and I didn't trust anything, especially myself, and I had zero connection to anything spiritual. I wanted nothing to do with it until I got dragged to my first yoga class. And this is one of my favorite stories to tell because I could not stand yoga at first. I just thought it was the worst. It was so slow and so painful, not physically, but mentally. Because for the first time in my life, I actually had to be with my thoughts. The beauty of Catholic praying is that you never actually have to listen. You just talk and talk and talk, and it can be all about you. God doesn't get a chance to say anything because you just fill the space with your own wishes and desires, right? Could you imagine being on the receiving end of like Catholic prayers? Like, put yourself in God's shoes for a moment. And it's just, oh man, I couldn't imagine. But anyway, in yoga, I had to be quiet. I had to breathe. I had to, oh my God, meditate. Ugh. Like, what is meditating? No way. There's no way. And I had spent so much time trying to distract myself from my thoughts, which was actually a really big part of the eating disorder. If you have an eating disorder, your hyperfixation on food occupies every moment of your life. So you don't have to think about anything except the obsession, the compulsion of just counting calories. And it's kind of brilliant that like our brains come up with that in the first place, that there's just this grand distraction that can really take you outside of your present moment. So yoga was that first time that I ever faced myself and looked at myself and looked at my inner world, and of course was so overwhelmed by what was in there. If we're going to talk about monkey mind and racing thoughts and basically just having the most cluttered brain on the planet, it was mine when I was 19. The amount of limiting beliefs that were in there, the amount of values that were not mine, they had been placed there by the generations before me. So much of what I had been born into, and it was just a cluster, you know what, in my brain. And it was a mess. And so yoga was the worst. And I really didn't want to keep going back. But I have this thing where I do not quit. And for better or for worse, like there's plenty of things in my life I should have quit. And I just never did, because I don't know why. I just didn't, it's just who I am as a person. And I was determined to figure out why people liked yoga so much and why people somehow believed that it made them more calm. I could not figure out how that was possibly the case, because your girl was not calm at all on that mat. She was a mess, a giant sloppy mess. But after about 2 months of being dragged to that class every week by my dear friend, who I still owe her for that, honestly. She really never gave up on me. I finally got to the end of this yoga practice and I laid down in Shavasana, which is essentially a pose at the end of every yoga class where you just lie on your back for a few minutes and you breathe and you let yourself be still and you let yourself integrate whatever movement or breath work you had done throughout the practice. And I laid in Shavasana, that's always tripped me up. I lied in Shavasana. As I lie in Shavasana, I felt calm for the first time, maybe in my whole entire life. And then I was hooked. I was like, oh my God, there is an access point to calm. There is an access point to peace. Holy crap, I found it. I need more of that. So of course, I started going to yoga. I think it was 3 times a week. That was how often they offered it. And I was in every single class until I graduated. As soon as I graduated, I became a yoga instructor. And then I taught yoga for 10 years. There were certain times where it was my full-time job. It was what I did. And it was my access point to the higher self-consciousness that I had never had access to when I was still doing the religion thing. For the first time in my life, I've started to recognize that God is accessible inward, not outward. Now, you can access God outward, don't get me wrong. The whole thing is God. I'm God, you're God, that's God, this is God. The whole thing is God, because the only thing that exists is God. And if that's a very woo-woo for you, and if that's super beyond you, that's okay. No worries. You're still welcome here, for sure. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to see it the same way that I do. But in my personal experience and understanding of the universe, everything that exists is made of God. Because if the Big Bang, if first there was nothing except for God, and then the Big Bang happened, that means that the Big Bang had to be made out of God. Yeah? Tell me what you think. But with that said, you can find God outward, but you can just as easily find God inward. And this tends to be the difference between Western and Eastern philosophy, or Western and Eastern religion. Western religion tends to place God outside of you. Whereas Eastern religion tends to place God inside of you. And they'll use different words to describe what God is based on the language that you're talking about, etc. But it was with yoga that I started to realize, oh my God, oh my goddess, I can access God via my own body, my own breath, and my own being. And this was where I started to learn how to trust myself and how to trust my own intuition. I still carried that skepticism of outside forces for a really long time, and I still am a pretty big skeptic. I will give anything a chance, but I've come to realize my human design is a 1-3, and we are the skeptics of the people. So if I do believe in something that is spiritual, it is also because I've done research on it, whether it was the psychology or the science or whatever. I'm always trying to look into these things. So, of course, I use my intuition. I really believe that I'm my own best compass and that my gut and my heart is always going to lead me wherever it is I need to go. And I also believe that when I want to know God, when I want to get closer to God, I get to know God by getting to know the observer inside of myself, the part of me that watches my thoughts. To me, that is where I most connect with God or source. If you're someone who has religious trauma, you might not like the word God, and that's totally okay. We can also say source, the universe, goddess, the divine feminine. There's so many ways that we can describe it, but at the end of the day, it is that universal fabric that connects everything with everything, and it is totally accessible to you. So this particular concept of that higher self-consciousness, of that God mind, of the source, this is what we're going to be exploring throughout Indigo Women, okay? And there's so many different angles and facets and ways that we can observe and connect to and embody and embrace this magical energy that is accessible to us all day, every day. So within this podcast/live stream, that is what we will be focusing on. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into today's subject matter, which is the transformative power of language and how changing our words can reshape our reality. So let's start by talking about the psychology of positive language. I had a client come to me recently, and she said, Nat, I cannot get motivated to do anything. She's like, the only thing that I ever feel motivated to do is my morning routine, which is to just, have my coffee, connect to the earth, ground, breathe, and just like say some gratitude. And I was like, oh, wow. Okay. So like you do have a routine. You feel motivated to do this thing every day. Why do you feel motivated to do this thing? And she said, because if I don't, I feel like a crazy person the whole day. I need it to be grounded. And if I don't do it, I know that there will be consequences. And I said, okay, this means that you are currently away motivated. So there's two different ways that we can motivate ourselves. We can motivate ourselves to get away from things that we don't want, or we can motivate ourselves to go to the things that we do want. So this particular client had a thinking pattern. She had an inner language pattern that told her that she had to do things because if she didn't do them, there would be consequences, as opposed to she gets to do things because they feel good and they give her pleasure, right? So that exact same morning routine of waking up, enjoying your cup of coffee, saying some prayers, setting some intentions, giving gratitude, that can be one of two things. It can be the thing that just makes you feel so good and so happy to be alive in the morning, or it can be the thing that you do to avoid pain. And what we noticed after talking for a while was that her away motivation with her morning routine ended up trickling into every other area of her life, where she only felt motivated to do things if it was to prevent future pain, as opposed to structuring her day so that she could feel pleasure for the things that she was doing and felt more motivated to go towards what she wanted. This all was remedied by using different language. That is the power of our words. So when she woke up in the morning, instead of saying, I have to do my routine, she started saying, I get to do my routine. And that tiny little tweak, have to get to, is so incredibly powerful. You have to do your laundry, or do you get to do your laundry? Saying that you have to do it feels like a burden. Don't you feel like a slave to this task of like, oh, I have to do it. If I don't do it, I won't have clean clothes. And then I'm going to have to walk around wearing all of my crappy, like, grandpa clothes that sit way in the back of my closet that don't look good on me. So I have to do it. Or I get to do my laundry. I have the privilege of washing clothes that belong to me, and I have lots of clothes. It's such a privilege to have so many beautiful articles of clothing. It's a privilege to have a washing machine and maybe a dryer. It's a privilege that I get to do this kind thing for my family or for my partner. It's a privilege that I get to take these moments out of my day to just be fully present with this task. That tiny little tweak can absolutely change how you perceive a task on your to-do list, and it can become a pleasure instead of a way to avoid pain. So let's talk a bit more about the impact of negative self-talk. One of my favorite examples is my grandparents. I had my mom's mom, who I called Grammy, and my mom's dad, who I called Pa Joe. I know it's silly, they're Polish, it's a thing. So we always joked around that Grammy could be in the Taj Mahal and find something wrong with it, whereas my Pa Joe could live in a paper box and be the happiest guy in the world. And it had everything to do with how they spoke. What was incredible is that towards the end of their lives, they both had health issues. Now, granted, there's a million different things that can impact someone's health. But the fascinating thing is that Grammy could barely move her body from the time I was very young. She was always fixated on all of the things that were wrong with her body, even though she would go to a bunch of different specialists and doctors who would run a million different tests and tell her, you know, you're actually looking okay. Like, we're not finding in our scientific studies of your body all of the issues that you are perceiving. Whereas my Pa Joe, on the other hand, he had so much arthritis in his back that he shouldn't have been able to walk, but he was up and moving and living his best life every single day. If you asked my Grammy, how are you? She would tell you every single thing that could possibly be wrong. And if you asked my Pa Joe, how are you? He would always talk about how blessed he is. This contrast is something that I grew up with, and I got to see firsthand the difference between someone who uses positive language every day of his life and someone who uses negative language every day of her life, and how that affects somebody over decades and decades of living. So how can we start to use this in our daily life? How can we start catching ourselves when we are using negative language and start correcting it towards positive language? My favorite thing is to take time every day to just sit somewhere beautiful and watch your thoughts. It doesn't have to be formal meditation. It doesn't need to be something that is complicated or in any way difficult. You don't even need to quiet your mind. It's actually sometimes helpful to just let your mind run, but step back and watch. You can even picture your mind running on a movie screen and you're just sitting back in the audience watching it run. If the movie is super depressing and really focused on everything ugly, then that's a really good indicator that you're using negative language both externally and internally. But if you can watch that screen and you're seeing lots of beauty and lots of gratitude and lots of happy things that happen during the day, that's a good indicator that you are using positive language, both verbally and within your own mind. Now, what's really cool is that once you start stopping those negative thoughts when you catch them, and it's actually really easy to do. I say thoughts and I'm also saying words, but anything that is language related, and we do tend to talk to ourselves in narrations. Not everybody, but a lot of people do narrate their inner worlds, and if you don't, that's incredible. Like I have heard that there are people who think completely in images or feelings, and I think that's absolutely brilliant. I personally am someone who tends to think with words. I narrate my own inner experience, but it could be inner words, could be outer words. We're using it a little interchangeably right now. What's really cool is that if you can catch yourself and correct it, you are going to start rewiring your subconscious mind. Okay, so your subconscious mind is where you are storing limiting beliefs. Depending on who you ask, we only use about 1 to 5% of our brain for conscious thoughts. The rest of it is all going on below the surface. There is so much happening in our brain that we have absolutely no conscious awareness over, which is wild when you think about it. So a lot of people have that question of like, okay, well, if it's all happening out of my conscious awareness, how on earth can I change it? If I have these limiting beliefs that tell me everything is wrong with the world and they're hanging out in my subconscious mind, how can I possibly get in there and tinker around and change it? It starts with our words. It starts with what we choose to say to ourselves and to others. So if you see a negative word or a negative sentiment popping up and you catch it, you can pluck it out and plant a new positive word in its place. That new positive word or phrase is going to spread its roots down into your subconscious mind and start rewiring all of those information superhighways that are going on in the background. Our minds are like train tracks, right? So once we have a belief, once we have a road or I don't know, a rail train. Oh, wow. I don't know what that's called. Once we have train tracks in our brains, we're going to think that same thought over and over and over and over. A belief is just a thought that you keep thinking. But taking a moment to stop a negative thought or a negative word or stop yourself from complaining and plucking it out and planting something new in its place, that will automatically start to divert that runaway train onto a different track. And the more that you do this, the more that you will begin to rewire that subconscious programming that is going on. These words give you access to your subconscious mind. So a nice way to start to reframe this is by taking something that you would normally complain about, pause, and ask yourself, how can I be grateful for this situation and what is it teaching me? Okay, so we're going to talk a lot about the ego in this podcast because our ego is our teacher and it plays a really important role in our lives and in our human experience. And the ego wants to be a victim, right? It doesn't want to be responsible for the way it thinks or the things it says. No, it wants to be a victim of life. It feels good to be a victim if you are an ego. So, of course, the ego is going to complain as much as possible unless you consciously train it to stop. And one way that you can train it to stop with all the complaining is to pause when you notice, oh, okay, this is like a runaway train of complaints. I'm going off about something right now, and it's just one thing is leading to the other, and I'm getting more and more upset as I go. But I'm going to pause. I'm going to say, you know what? Even though that put me in a bad mood, here's what I learned from it. And if you can suck the juice of the lessons out of your experience, you will find it so much easier to create gratitude for them. So for me, my most perfect example is my family relationships. I have a very complicated relationship with my family. It has been the biggest teacher of my whole entire life, except maybe the other stuff that I talked about earlier with the essay and the ED, those were pretty big lessons for me as well. But I would say that currently, my biggest teacher has been my relationship with my family. So, of course, when everything all started going down a good 6 or 7 years ago, I did nothing but complain. And I was convinced that I was the victim of the situation. But over time, I have been able to look at every situation, every very difficult conversation, every blow up, every argument, every whatever. And I've been able to go, you know what? I learned that I'm strong. I learned that I can stand up for myself. I learned that I have grit and determination. I learned that I can walk away from things that are not good for me, etc., etc., etc. And you can go on, and you can find the lesson. If you can find the lesson in the things that you would normally complain about, you will be able to rewrite the limiting beliefs in your subconscious mind using the transformative power of language. And this is such an empowering tool to have in your tool belt. When you take charge of the words you use internally and externally, you become the queen of your reality, of your experience. This is really powerful stuff. And we're going to talk about this in so many different ways, shapes, and forms within this podcast and on this live stream. But for right now, I just want to leave you with a little homework assignment, if that's okay, which is noticing instead of using the word have to. So noticing anytime that you say, I have to do something, and giving yourself that opportunity to try out using the words, I get to do something, and see how that changes your experience, right? All right, my friends. So if you are someone who is currently feeling stuck with a limiting belief, you're like, okay, Nat, I've already done some of this like positive thinking, talking stuff, and I'm still stuck on some of these deeper ones. There's like layers to the onion that I just can't quite reach yet. Please feel free to reach out and schedule a complimentary subconscious reprogramming call with me. This is a really cool opportunity for you to get a little deeper into that onion and start pulling up some of those limiting beliefs that you just don't want to carry with you into the next chapter of life. Thank you very much for tuning in today. I really appreciate it. Please feel free to leave your feedback, leave your comments. Again, I love interacting with my followers, listeners, clients, etc. And please tune in next week at the same time for our next episode, where we're going to talk about making friends with your ego. It's going to be really juicy. I can't wait to share it all with you. I hope that you guys have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.